Okay, if we talk about Conor, last couple of years he's not hungry. And now what happened with his legs, like, never ever. Never people come back, and never gonna be people on same crime twice. Crime come only one time. You're gonna be on time, after that you're gonna go down.
Max Holloway for the win, 100%. People think that Max is just going to walk through Conor because he will melt him. And when he's melted and just sort of going there shooting because he's so tired. But I still think that the submission going to be the way to go. When he turns over and just gives it back. It ain't going to be that easy. So it's
this Conor McGregor fight in July is going to be fucking bananas. It's going to be bananas. I mean, people are going to go crazy for the return of Conor McGregor because he's a giant personality.
But don't expect the same thing.
How could
you
it
just
be?
can't.
He hasn't fought in 5 years,
That's
right?
exactly it.
It's been 5
and
years.
but that's the problem.
It might be more.
Because they're going to all
I think it's a
expect
little
that.
over. I think it is a little over 5. It's almost 6, I think.
It might be 6 at the time of the fight.
It might be.
I think it was
it's
July.
5. I think it's 5 right now.
Are we expecting to see a Conor that looked like Nate this last fight? Or are we expecting to see a better Conor than someone that looked like Nate? Because Nate did not look good.
No,
Well,
Mike
but-
Perry did.
And
Mike
yeah.
Perry looked like a fucking murderer.
You know what I mean? Like,
Mike Perry is a murderer.
He's a murderer.
and this is
Such a savage.
You take a look at that, and when you're taking an older fighter, which Nate is now, and you're
21.
You're
5 fucking years ago, July. So it literally will be 6 years.
Yep.
yeah.
But when
Oh
you're
no,
taking
it'll be 5 years.
5
It'll be
years.
5
5
years.
years.
In-
when you're taking a younger fighter and putting them against the old dog, it normally doesn't end well for the old dog.
5 years ago, Khabib Nurmagomedov looked into a camera and delivered a verdict on Conor McGregor's future that sounded less like an opinion and more like a death sentence. Now, with McGregor days away from stepping back into the Octagon at UFC 329, those words are resurfacing, and they hit differently than they did back in 2021. The context matters here, because this wasn't some throwaway comment made in the heat of a rivalry. This came in a sit-down interview with ESPN's Brett Okamoto, recorded shortly after McGregor's leg snapped in his trilogy fight against Dustin Poirier at UFC 264. Khabib, already retired at that point with a perfect record, wasn't speaking as a rival looking to score points. He was speaking as a former champion who'd spent his entire career studying exactly what separates fighters who stay elite from fighters who fade, and what he saw in McGregor's situation troubled him enough to say it on camera. "People come back and never gonna be on the same prime twice," Khabib said. "Prime comes only one time. After that, you're gonna go down." Sit with that for a second, because it's not really a comment about McGregor specifically. It's a broader theory about how this sport works, one Khabib clearly believed applied to every fighter, not just the one he'd beaten years earlier in one of the most explosive events in UFC history. His argument was that physical peak in combat sports is a narrow, unrepeatable window. You hit it once, your body and your reflexes align perfectly with your skill and your hunger, and once that window closes, whether through age, injury, or simply the accumulated damage of a career, it doesn't reopen, not with better training, not with more motivation. It's gone, permanently, according to Khabib's read on the sport. That alone would have been a notable claim about a former rival, but Okamoto pushed further, asking directly whether McGregor could ever fully commit himself again and return to championship form. Khabib's answer split the question into two separate realities. Without broken legs, yes, he said. Then, without hesitation, he closed that door completely. But with broken legs, never. Because he's never gonna kick same. I don't believe him. That distinction is worth unpacking, because it wasn't Khabib dismissing McGregor's talent or written him off as simply too old or too distracted. He was making a specific, almost clinical argument about the physical reality of a broken tibia, a leg that snaps clean in half during a kick, the way McGregor's did against Poirier, doesn't just heal and return to its old form. The surgical repair, the plates, the screws, the months of rehabilitation, all of it changes how that limb functions under real fight pressure, according to Khabib's reasoning. Kicks generate power through the exact mechanism that broke that night. Khabib's argument was that no amount of recovery fully restores that mechanism to what it was before the injury. Then came the part of the interview that stung the most, not because it was cruel, but because of how coldly practical it was. Khabib suggested that if McGregor wasn't going to return to elite form, the UFC's smartest move would simply be to extract as much commercial value from him as possible while he could still sell pay-per-views. He wasn't advocating for McGregor's career. He was describing what he saw as the honest, transactional reality of where McGregor's stock stood at that moment. A superstar whose box office pull no longer matched his in-cage ceiling. That framing tells you something about how Khabib actually views this sport, separate from any personal history with McGregor. To him, there are two entirely different currencies at play in the UFC: competitive relevance and commercial value. A fighter can lose the first entirely while still holding enormous amounts of the second, and Khabib was essentially arguing that McGregor had already crossed that line by mid-2021, years before this current comeback was ever announced. Whether that argument still holds up 5 years later, after a full recovery and a complete training camp, is exactly what UFC 329 is going to test in front of a global audience. Later in that same conversation, Khabib returned to the injury itself, framing it as a kind of cautionary tale about what happens when a fighter's focus slips. He pointed to McGregor's broken leg as evidence of a deeper problem, arguing that the injury wasn't just bad luck, but a symptom of a fighter who'd lost the singular hunger and preparation that once made him nearly untouchable. In Khabib's view, the leg break wasn't the disease. It was a visible symptom of something that had already been happening for years before that night in Las Vegas. That's a harder claim to evaluate objectively because it blends physical analysis with something closer to a moral judgment about discipline and preparation. Serious leg injuries in combat sports happen to disciplined, well-prepared fighters too, sometimes from nothing more than an unlucky angle on a checked kick. But Khabib's broader point, that the years leading up to that injury were marked by inconsistent training and outside distractions pulling McGregor's focus away from the sport, reflected a narrative plenty of analysts were already circulating at the time, based on McGregor's sporadic activity and very public life outside the Octagon during that stretch of his career. Now fast forward to July 11th, 2026. McGregor is stepping back into the Octagon against Max Holloway at UFC 329, 5 years removed from the injury Khabib said would end him. The leg that snapped has had half a decade to heal under professional care. Training footage from this camp has shown a fighter working with real intensity alongside longtime coach John Kavanagh. And yet Khabib's core argument, that some window, once closed, doesn't reopen, is exactly the question this entire fight is going to answer in real time. It's worth being honest about what's actually being tested here. Khabib's prediction wasn't really about whether McGregor could win a single fight. It was a broader claim about physical ceilings, about whether a body that's absorbed that kind of trauma can ever again produce the same speed, the same power, the same kicking mechanics that made McGregor one of the most feared strikers of his generation. Betting markets and prediction models heading into July 11 have leaned toward Holloway as the favorite, citing McGregor's 5-year layoff as the central uncertainty. That's a different conversation than Khabib's, focused more on ring rust and activity than on structural permanent physical decline, but the two arguments circle the same basic question from different angles. Is this version of McGregor capable of operating at anything close to his old level, or is Khabib's theory about primes and broken legs about to be proven right in the most public way possible? There's also a layer of personal history that makes Khabib's comments impossible to separate from context entirely. These two men share one of the most notorious rivalries in UFC history, built on real animosity that spilled outside the cage after their 2018 fight in Las Vegas. Khabib has never pretended to be a neutral observer when it comes to McGregor, and that history is worth keeping in mind when weighing how much weight to give his prediction. A rival who beat you decisively and who has been openly critical of your character in the years since isn't necessarily wrong when he makes a technical argument about injury and physical decline. But it's fair to ask whether some of that certainty was shaped by more than pure fight analysis. It's also worth noting that this wasn't a one-off comment buried in a random interview. This was a full sit-down conversation with one of the most respected MMA journalists in the business, recorded specifically to get Khabib's honest read on the sport after his own retirement. He wasn't goaded into a soundbite. He laid out a full theory, applied it directly to McGregor's specific injury, and stood behind every part of it without hedging. That level of directness is rare, even by Khabib's normally blunt standards, and it's part of why these particular comments have aged into something people keep coming back to every time McGregor's name resurfaces in a major fight. Still, dismissing the substance of what Khabib said entirely would be its own mistake. He's not some outside commentator guessing at how injuries affect fighters. He built his own career on suffocating wrestling and physical dominance, understood better than almost anyone what it takes to operate at the highest level of this sport, and retired undefeated specifically because he refused to let his own body's decline become part of his story. When a fighter with that level of self-awareness about physical peaks says something this direct about an opponent's future, it carries weight beyond simple rivalry, even if the framing was blunt. What happens on July 11th will settle at least part of this argument, one way or another. If McGregor looks sharp, if his kicks land with anything close to their old snap, if he moves like a fighter whose leg genuinely healed, rather than one permanently altered by the break, Khabib's theory takes a real hit. If McGregor struggles specifically with mobility, with commitment behind his strikes, with the kind of hesitation that sometimes follows serious leg injuries, it'll be hard not to think back to that ESPN interview and wonder if Khabib simply saw something the rest of the sport wasn't ready to accept back in 2021. 5 years is a long time for a prediction to sit unresolved. Whatever happens inside that octagon on July 11 finally gives the sport a real answer, one way or the other, to a question Khabib raised with total confidence the moment he watched that leg snap on live television. So which side of this are you on? Did Khabib call it back in 2021, or is McGregor about to prove one of the most decorated fighters in UFC history wrong? 5 years of healing, a full camp with Kavanaugh, and a real opponent in Holloway are about to give this argument its first genuine test since the day Khabib first made it. Let us know your